Greetings from Taiwan, dear friends. The topic of today's vlog will be Lao Cha, or aged tea. Certainly I've talked about this topic before on my vlog several times. But I always like to tell you why I love tea, and why I love China, and why I love life in general. Life is such that when you change your geographical location, travel a lot, observe new things, you inevitably start to possess more new information. As I always say about tea, the more you travel around China, around Taiwan, the more new things you start to see. It seems that I've never had a single trip where I haven't learned something completely new. As the saying goes, live for a century, learn for a century. This saying is more than applicable to the study of tea and tea culture. Concerning aged tea, many people know that the term aged tea is normally used for Yunnan pu'er tea. It's thought that the longer pu'er is aged, the better it becomes. This includes ripe or shu pu'er, which we like to drink in Russia. It's also known as artificially aged or cooked ripe pu'er, if we correctly translate shu pu'er from Chinese. This type of tea was invented in the 1970s as an attempt to imitate aged tea, which naturally becomes similar to ripe pu'er after long aging periods. And so some people think that aged tea refers to ripe pu'er, shu pu'er. But of course later, the term Lao Cha became more well known in Russia, especially in relation to Taiwan tea, or as it's often called Lao Cha Wang, which can be translated as King of Aged Tea, or High Grade Aged Tea. Later, Hei Cha, dark tea, became more well known. I'm talking specifically about its popularity in Russia and in the Russian segment of the internet. So terms like aged Hei Cha were becoming more well known amongst Russian tea drinkers. Aged Hei Cha from Sichuan, Guangxi, Luan, Anhui, from different provinces of China. Later, many other kinds of aged tea began to emerge in the Russian and Western markets. And I'd say that Taiwan was particularly prominent in that regard, because tea aging is a special tradition here, and is more widespread than in mainland China. Of course, in mainland China, we're starting to see more and more of that, but in Taiwan, the tradition of tea aging is much older, and the term Lao Cha here is a sort of foundation of the tea culture. Pretty much any tea person here, or factory, any shop, possesses some quantity of Lao Cha. They often keep some tea which appears to them as the most interesting for aging. Especially I'd like to highlight the fact that it's not so important which particular type of tea is used for aging. There's an opinion that aged tea is simply spoiled tea, and some people think such tea is not fresh, etc. However, any tea of high quality, which was made from good leaves and was processed well, has the potential for aging. Interestingly, regardless of which type of tea it is, be it some light tea, lightly oxidized oolong, or even green tea, it can also be aged and can undergo very interesting transformations. One thing that I like about Taiwan is that, for instance, on this trip, I found some teas which really surprised me. Some aged red teas, which I've seen before, but every time I discover something novel. And the most interesting aspect of Lao Cha is that every single Lao Cha is totally unique, like a unique tea variety, because the end result depends on the initial tea, on how and where the tea was stored, and how the aging process was done, and on whether or not it was processed during the aging period. As I discussed in previous videos, there are many ways of making traditional Taiwan aged oolong. Some tea makers do additional hongbei, roasting, throughout the aging period, and some don't. A similar thing can be seen in aged wuyi oolongs. So that's why the tea is unique every time. There's no one single right way to make aged tea. One tea master can say it's this way, while the other can say it's that way. But both of them can make good tea in its own way. However, it's thought that post-processing of Lao Cha is not compulsory. If the raw material is of high quality, it's enough to simply put the tea in some enclosed vessel. In Taiwan, usually big clay jars are used for that purpose. Or it can even be a big plastic bag placed inside a tin can. It doesn't have to be a traditional vessel. And it just sits there, while the tea continues to change and transform. Often the access to oxygen is restricted, but for teas like pu'er, the opposite might be the case. It's believed that pu'er tea should have plenty of air flowing around it, and that's why it's typically wrapped in paper. Lao Cha is a separate type of tea, and as mentioned previously, aged tea of every type is quite unique, especially if the original tea was interesting. That's why I have a lot of interest in searching for such teas, and in every shop, tea farm or factory, I always ask if they have something unusual and special. They don't always have it, and sometimes even if they do, it's not very good. Sometimes what people call Lao Cha is really just some fake, a young tea which was quickly processed using high temperatures, but it remains low quality relative to real Lao Cha. Genuine Lao Cha has several unique characteristics. The first one is of course heavy fermentation. Even if it was a light tea, it gets darker and richer and thicker with time. Then there's always the so-called Chen wave present, or the aged taste. It appears differently in different types of Lao Cha. And the most interesting Chen wei can be found in oolongs. Although raw pu'er teas are also famous for it. However, raw pu'er aged for 20 years or more loses the flavour of dried fruit and flowers and develops a powerful aged taste. Raw pu'er aged for 10 to 15 years is somewhat more approachable for mainstream tea drinkers, while aged oolongs are quite different. Even very old oolong, aged for 30 or 40 years, still has a very rich and vibrant flavour. Especially interesting are aged yan cha, Wuyi oolongs. Such teas can also be found in Taiwan, since they were brought here from the mainland. The quantities are low and such teas are expensive, but it's not very rare. Another feature of aged tea is of course its infusibility. Since the longer a tea is aged for, the more powerful its energy becomes. It acquires more cha ki, which goes deeper into the leaves. If I may use this somewhat esoteric term here, one could use biochemical terminology to explain this phenomenon, but since I'm not a biochemist, I'll explain it from the perspective of the cha ki. As the tea masters and manufacturers of Taiwan and mainland China also say, the cha ki, the tea energy, goes deep into the tea leaves, and that's why it becomes more infusible. The denser the original tea leaf was, the longer it can be infused for later. I've also seen aged red teas, made from small leaf material, that could also be infused many times, over 15 steeps. Another common stereotype is that there is no aged tea. It's been said about pu'er and oolong teas, that there's extremely little of it, or it's all fake, etc. I would say that I've been to numerous different storehouses where there are literally tons of Lao Cha, mostly of course in Yunnan, for instance at the Changtai factory, which has huge storehouses where aged, caked and loose leaf pu'er is stored. Similar things can be seen at storehouses in Fujian. Here's one old video where I went to one of those storehouses, where one person collects aged red tea, aged yan cha, etc. He even had an aged green tea. In Taiwan, I haven't seen such enormous storehouses, but one way or another, you see people collecting Lao Cha, and there's no need for such people to invent something or fake the tea, because there are not so many Lao Cha enthusiasts, and Chinese and Asians like to drink fresh, light teas. But your interest in Lao Cha gives you the identity of some sort of tea specialist or connoisseur. So almost always it's perceived this way, and not everyone understands such tea. That's why there's no huge demand for it. So of course there is Lao Cha out there, but as the saying goes, yue yuan yue gui, The further, the more expensive. And yue la, yue hao. The longer, the better. And the most common and simple one, yue la, yue zhang. Or yue chen, yue zhang. The older, the more fragrant. These sayings can often be seen written on pu'er cake wrappers. That's the end of my short narration. I want to wish you pleasant tea sessions and see you next time.